My son entered my room while I was asleep, a true story of infidelity. It was a night like any other. Or at least that's what I thought. My name is Clara, and if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's how to juggle exhaustion with a brave face. Being a single mum to Ethan, my 19-year-old son, hasn't been easy, but it's been the most fulfilling thing in my life. That evening, though, I wasn't feeling particularly heroic. Work had drained me completely, and all I wanted was to collapse into my bed and let sleep take over. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. Ethan had been in his room for hours, likely alternating between homework and his endless video games. The silence felt like a rare luxury. I relished the stillness, feeling like, for once, the world had given me a moment to breathe. I dragged myself through my nightly routine, barely finding the energy to change into pajamas. By the time I climbed into bed, I could barely keep my eyes open. The room was bathed in the soft silver glow of moonlight seeping through the thin curtains. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and sank into the warm cocoon of my mattress. For a moment, as my head hit the pillow, I felt a flicker of peace. Life had been tough lately, but there was something comforting about the predictable rhythm of our quiet nights. Ethan and I had been through so much together since his father walked away. We'd built our own version of a family, just the two of us, and I was finally beginning to feel like we had a handle on things. But peace is a funny thing. Just when you start to feel it, life finds a way to remind you that nothing is ever quite as simple as it seems. The night was still, the kind of quiet that made you believe the world outside didn't exist. I was hovering on the edge of sleep, the blanket pulled snug around me, my breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the ticking clock. But just as my body began to surrender to the pull of exhaustion, there was a sound. A soft, hesitant knock on my bedroom door. At first I thought I had imagined it. My mind was too foggy, too tangled in the haze of sleep to trust my ears. Then it came again, a little firmer this time. "Mom?" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough to jolt me awake. I blinked a few times, propping myself up on my elbows to glance at the door. The faint glow from the hallway outlined his tall frame, a shadowy figure that seemed to hesitate before stepping inside. "Ethan." My voice was thick with sleep, concern lacing the single word. "What's wrong?" He stood there for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the doorknob. There was something about the way he lingered, unsure of himself, that immediately put me on edge. Ethan wasn't the type to wake me up without a reason. "I couldn't sleep," he finally said, his tone soft, almost apologetic. He avoided my eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere near the floor. The weight in his voice pulled at my chest. Ethan had struggled with sleep ever since the divorce. He never talked about it directly, but I knew the changes in our lives had hit him harder than he let on. His father leaving had left a hole, one he tried to fill with distractions, school, friends, his endless gaming sessions. But nights like this made it clear that some wounds linger longer than others. "Come here," I said, patting the empty space on the bed beside me. "You can stay with me tonight if you want." He hesitated just for a second, before crossing the room and climbing into bed. He lay down on his side facing me, and for the first time I noticed how tired he looked. There were dark shadows under his eyes, a heaviness in his expression that made him seem older than his years. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked quietly. He shook his head, his dark hair falling over his eyes. "No, I just wanted to be near you." My heart softened at his words, a wave of tenderness washing over me. It had been so long since Ethan had come to me like this, seeking comfort the way he used to when he was little. I reached out and brushed the hair from his forehead, offering a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay," I whispered. "Stay as long as you need." He smiled back faintly, but there was something else behind his eyes, a flicker of emotion I couldn't quite name. I chose not to push him, letting the quiet settle between us as I pulled the blanket over us both. The silence wrapped around us like a protective cocoon, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world didn't matter. The room had fallen into an almost tangible stillness, broken only by the soft sound of Ethan's breathing beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. I thought he might have drifted off, but then in a voice so quiet it almost melted into the silence, he asked, "Mum, do you ever miss him?" The question startled me, though I didn't need to ask who he meant. I turned my head slightly, looking at him through the dim moonlight. Ethan's face was serious, his eyes fixed on mine, searching for something. "Sometimes," I admitted softly. "But you know things weren't right between us, Ethan. Your dad and I, We just grew apart. He nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. Do you ever think it could have been different if I had been different? His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I sat up a little, turning fully to face him. Ethan, no. Don't ever think that. None of this was your fault. Nothing you could have done would have changed what happened between your father and me. But it feels like it was, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Like if I'd been better, maybe Dad wouldn't have left. Tears welled in my eyes as I reached for him, pulling him close. At first he resisted, but after a moment he let himself relax into my arms, burying his face against my shoulder. Listen to me, I said, my voice trembling with emotion. Your dad made his own choices, and those choices had nothing to do with you. Ethan, you've always been more than enough. You've been my everything. He nodded against my shoulder, but I could feel the tension in his body, the weight he had been carrying for so long without letting me see it. How had I missed this? How had I not realized how deeply he'd been blaming himself? We stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other. Slowly I felt the rigidity in his shoulders start to ease. His breathing grew steadier, deeper, and I thought he might have fallen asleep. But then, just as softly as before, he spoke again. I'm glad I have you, Mum. Even when it's hard, I know you're always here for me. The words wrapped around my heart, a bittersweet reminder of how much he'd endured and how strong he'd become despite it all. And I always will be, I whispered, pressing a kiss to his hair. As his breathing evened out completely, I lay back down beside him, my mind swirling with memories of the past, the pain, the struggles, the nights I cried myself to sleep wondering how I'd ever managed to raise him on my own. But as I held Ethan close, I realized those doubts had faded long ago. No matter what, we had each other. And that had always been enough. The room was quiet again, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a blanket. Ethan's breathing was slow and steady now, his body relaxed beside mine. I stared up at the ceiling, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic mix of relief and guilt. How had I not seen how much he'd been holding in? How many nights had he felt this weight, alone in the dark without saying a word? But as I lay there, something shifted in the air between us. It wasn't just the comforting silence of mother and son. It was something deeper, more fragile. Ethan turned slightly, and when I glanced over at him, his eyes were open, watching me. Are you okay? He asked, his voice soft but steady. I nodded, but the truth was harder to put into words. I felt raw, exposed, like a nerve that had been touched for the first time in years. I'm fine, I whispered, brushing a hand through his hair instinctively. I'm just thinking about everything. Ethan didn't say anything, but his gaze didn't waver. There was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite name, vulnerability maybe, or gratitude, or perhaps a mix of emotions I wasn't ready to confront. For a moment it felt like we were suspended in time. His hand, almost unconsciously, brushed against mine as he shifted closer. It was such a small gesture, so subtle, but it sent a warmth spreading through me that I couldn't explain. Thank you, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. For what? For always being here for me, he replied, his eyes searching mine. Even when I feel like I don't deserve it. I shook my head, my chest tightening at his words. Ethan, you deserve everything. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. The corner of his mouth lifted into a faint smile, but there was still that flicker of something unspoken behind his expression. I wanted to ask him what it was, to probe deeper, but instead I let the moment linger. We stayed like that for a while, just lying side by side, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. His presence, his closeness, was soothing in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was more than just maternal love. It was a connection, pure and unfiltered, that reminded me of all the reasons we'd made it this far together. As Ethan's breathing grew deeper, I thought he'd finally fallen asleep. But just as I was beginning to relax, his voice cut through the darkness again. Mom? Yeah. Do you think things are going to be okay? Like, really okay? The question hung in the air, so vulnerable it almost broke me. I reached for his hand, holding it tightly in mine. I don't know what's ahead, I admitted, my voice soft but steady. But as long as we have each other, I think we'll be okay. Don't you? Ethan nodded, his grip on my hand tightening ever so slightly. "Yeah, I think so too." And with that, he closed his eyes, his face softening into peacefulness. I watched him for a long time, my heart full but heavy. There was a warmth between us that I couldn't quite put into words, a bond that felt unshakable, yet somehow new. As the moonlight spilled across the room, I realized I'd never felt so close to Ethan, not just as his mum, but as someone he trusted completely. It was a beautiful, overwhelming feeling, one I couldn't quite define but wasn't ready to let go of. The first light of morning crept through the curtains, soft and golden, pulling me gently from the depths of sleep. I opened my eyes slowly, still caught in the warmth of the blankets and the quiet intimacy of the night before. For a moment, everything felt still, as if the world outside hadn't woken up yet. I turned my head to find Ethan still asleep beside me. His face was calm, free from the tension and weight I'd seen in his expression just hours ago. He looked younger in that moment, almost like the boy he used to be before life demanded so much of him. My chest tightened at the sight. Careful not to wake him, I slid out of bed and tiptoed downstairs. The familiar routine of making breakfast grounded me, but my mind kept wandering back to the events of the night before. I flipped pancakes on autopilot, the scent of butter and syrup filling the kitchen, but my thoughts were anything but routine. Ethan's words echoed in my mind, his confession of guilt over the divorce, the way he'd sought comfort in my presence. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he looked at me, the vulnerability in his eyes that stayed with me. There was something else too, something I hadn't allowed myself to fully process, a shift subtle but undeniable, in the way he'd held my gaze, in the way his hand had brushed against mine. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. "He's my son," I reminded myself firmly. But the feeling lingered, stubborn and unrelenting. The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled me back to the present. I turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his hair mussed from sleep, rubbing his eyes like he used to when he was a kid. The sight brought a soft smile to my face, even as the weight of my thoughts pressed down on me. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice groggy. "Morning," I replied, sliding a plate of pancakes onto the table. "Hope you're hungry." Ethan sat down, glancing at me with a small smile. "Thanks, Mum." We ate in silence for a while, the kind that felt comfortable but heavy all at once. Finally, he broke the quiet. "Thanks for last night, I really needed that." I looked up at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "You don't have to thank me, Ethan. I'll always be here for you, you know that." He nodded but didn't look away, his gaze lingering on mine a little longer than usual. There was something in his eyes, something that made my breath catch for just a moment. I quickly looked down, focusing on my plate, but the tension stayed. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, it was just different. Like we were teetering on the edge of something unspoken, something neither of us knew how to address. Ethan finished his breakfast and leaned back in his chair. His movements relaxed, but his expression thoughtful. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said quietly. My heart clenched at his words, a mix of pride and something else I couldn't quite name. I reached across the table and gave his hand a squeeze. "You'll never have to find out," I said, my voice firm but soft. His lips twitched into a small smile, but that look in his eyes stayed with me long after he left the table. I busied myself with cleaning up, but the lingering warmth from his hand in mine and the subtle shift in our dynamic refused to leave my thoughts. Something had changed between us. It wasn't big or obvious, but it was there, hovering in the quiet moments like a shadow I couldn't ignore. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Things between Ethan and me would never be quite the same. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but it wasn't the usual kind of busy that kept my mind occupied. I went about my usual chores, laundry, cleaning, organising the house, but no matter what I did, my thoughts kept circling back to Ethan. It wasn't just what we had talked about the night before, it was the way it all felt. The way he had looked at me with those unguarded eyes, his presence so close yet so calm. There was a tenderness in it, a quiet trust that felt different, and I couldn't shake it. Ethan spent most of the day in his room. Occasionally I'd hear the faint sounds of his favourite game through the walls, the occasional laugh or exasperated sigh. It was comforting in a way, like a familiar soundtrack to our lives. But there was also a tension in the air, a subtle shift that made everything feel just a little more charged. At one point he came downstairs to grab a snack. I was folding laundry in the living room, a mindless task I'd been clinging to in an effort to keep my thoughts from spiraling. Ethan paused as he walked past, his eyes flicking to the pile of clothes in my lap. "Need help?" he asked casually, but there was a warmth in his tone that made my chest tighten. I shook my head, offering him a small smile. "No, I've got it. Thanks, though." He nodded but didn't leave right away. Instead, he lingered for a moment, leaning against the doorway. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I glanced up, he was watching me with that same quiet intensity I'd noticed at breakfast. "What?" I asked, trying to sound light-hearted. Ethan shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Nothing. Just, you look tired. You should take a break." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You sound like me when you stay up too late." He smirked but didn't argue. "Well, someone has to look out for you, right?" There it was again, that warmth, that subtle, unspoken connection. It was such a small moment, so ordinary on the surface, yet it lingered in my mind long after he'd gone back upstairs. Later, as I was making dinner, Ethan came into the kitchen. He didn't say much, just hovered nearby, opening cabinets and occasionally offering to grab something for me. It wasn't unusual for him to be around while I cooked, but tonight felt different. There was a quiet closeness to it, like he didn't want to leave but wasn't sure how to stay. At one point, as I handed him a plate to set on the table, our fingers brushed. The contact was fleeting, just a brief moment of skin against skin, but it sent a warmth through me that I couldn't explain. Ethan's eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a split second, neither of us moved. "Thanks," he said, his voice soft. "Of course," I replied, my throat suddenly dry. The rest of the evening played out in a similar rhythm, little moments that felt loaded with meaning, a glance held a second too long, a touch that lingered just slightly more than it should. It was nothing overt, nothing anyone else would notice, but I felt it. I knew he did too. When the day finally wound down and Ethan disappeared upstairs again, I sat alone in the quiet of the living room. My thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and longing, of love and uncertainty. These little gestures, so small and seemingly insignificant, were beginning to feel like puzzle pieces of something much larger. Something was shifting between us, and though I didn't know where it was leading, I couldn't deny that I felt it too. The house was quiet again, bathed in the soft glow of the evening. Ethan was sitting on the couch beside me, a movie playing on the TV, but neither of us was really watching. My mind was elsewhere, and I could sense his was too. There was an unspoken tension in the air, something delicate and electric, like the moments before a storm. Ethan shifted slightly, his arm brushing against mine. It wasn't intentional, at least I didn't think it was, but he didn't move away. Instead, he let it linger, his warmth pressing against me in a way that felt both natural and unfamiliar. I glanced over at him, and he was already looking at me. His gaze was soft but steady, holding something unspoken in its depths. "What's on your mind?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, though my heartbeat quickened. Ethan hesitated, his eyes flicking away for a moment before returning to mine. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about us." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" He swallowed hard, his hand nervously fidgeting with the edge of the blanket draped over his lap. "I mean, I feel like things are changing between us. I don't know when it started, but I can't stop thinking about it." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My thoughts raced, trying to process what he was saying, what he might mean. "I don't want this to sound wrong," he continued, his voice almost breaking. "But I don't think I see you the same way anymore. Not just as my mom, there's something more." The room seemed to shrink around us, the space between us feeling impossibly small. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of his words, the weight of them settling over me like a fog. "Ethan," I started, my voice trembling slightly. "Are you sure this isn't just—" "It's not," he interrupted gently, his eyes earnest. "I've thought about it so much. I tried to push it away, but I can't. I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone, and I don't know what to do with that." His confession was raw, vulnerable, and it left me breathless. A part of me wanted to brush it off, to tell him he was confused, that this was just a passing phase. But another part of me, the part that had been feeling that same unspoken shift, couldn't deny that I understood exactly what he meant. I reached out instinctively, placing my hand over his. Ethan, this is a lot. I don't even know how to respond. You don't have to, he said quickly, his fingers curling slightly under mine. I just needed you to know I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. For a long moment, we sat there in silence, the movie forgotten, the room impossibly still. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his hand under mine, the quiet intensity of his confession hanging between us. Finally, I squeezed his hand gently, my voice soft but steady. No matter what, I'm here for you. We'll figure this out together, okay? Ethan exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly as a small, tentative smile tugged at his lips. Thank you, he murmured. I nodded, my own emotions swirling like a storm inside me. I didn't know what this meant for us or where it might lead, but one thing was certain. Our relationship had changed and there was no going back. That evening felt different from the start. The air between Ethan and me seemed thicker, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. We had finished dinner in relative quiet, exchanging small smiles and light conversation that felt more like a placeholder for everything neither of us was saying. Later, we ended up on the couch again, watching another movie. This had always been our routine. A way to unwind together, to connect after long days. But tonight the routine felt heavier, like the familiar rhythm had shifted into something neither of us entirely understood. Ethan sat closer to me than usual, his arm brushing against mine. I could feel the warmth of his body next to me, and it was distracting in a way I wasn't used to. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, trying to focus on the dialogue of the movie, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore.